In this segment, I'd like to illustrate one of the capabilities of structural adjustment rules. These are the last rules in the transfer grammar, and as I've mentioned before, the transfer grammar is responsible for performing the transfer step of the translation process. So the transfer grammar is responsible for restructuring these semantic representations, reworking them in whatever way is necessary in order to build a new underlying representation that's appropriate for your target language. I'd like to illustrate in this segment how we can use multiple concepts in a structural adjustment rule to set a feature. So I'm going to enter a new group. I'll double click on that node. I will call this group subordinate clauses. Now I'll double click on this group name, and we see a dialog that prompts us to select a semantic category. We should select the semantic category that is most responsible for triggering the rule that we're going to write. In this case, we're going to enter this concept when, which is an add position, a relation. So I'm going to select add positions. Now here we see an empty structural adjustment rule. This dialog is identical to the dialog that we saw when we were working on theta grid adjustment rules. The only difference is that in the theta grid adjustment rules, TBTA knows the theta grid for each event and each object attribute. So it built the input structures for us. In this case, this rule is now empty. So we need to build our own input structure, and then we'll go to the output structure and specify the changes that we want to make. In this particular case, I'm going to say insert word. We'll insert a source concept, which is an add position. When is an add position? Now if I open this list here, we'll see all of the add positions that are in the ontology. It's always much quicker to click this button labeled lexical subset, and this dialog will come up and it will always be set to the current verse, in this case clauses 168. So we can say OK, and now this list will contain only the add positions that are in the current verse. So there's only one in this case, and it's when. Okay, so after we've inserted when into the input structure, that's all we need to specify. We don't care about the agent or the verb or anything like that. So now we'll go to the output structure, and I want this rule to set a feature. Here are all of the features that have been defined for clauses, but we haven't yet defined a feature called adverbial clause position. So I'm going to click this button, feature set, and we're going to define a new feature. It'll be called adverbial clause position. And whenever you define a new feature, you should start towards the end and work your way towards the top. The reason for that is, if we, the people who develop TBTA semantic representations, if someday we need to add a new feature to propositions, we'll start by using the first spares. So we'll be working from this direction in order to keep your grammar, or in order to prevent your grammar from overlapping with features that we define for the semantic representations. You need to start with the bottom spares. So we're going to say spare 12. Edit features name. Let's call this adverbial clause position. In English, adverbial clauses are either preposed or postposed. So there are two values, and now that feature is available for us. In English, we generally prepose adverbial clauses that begin with when. So I'm going to say preposed. So this output structure will just set the feature called adverbial clause position to preposed. For our topics, let's select adverbial clauses. Let's enter a name. Adverbial clauses Now, so far we haven't done anything with postpose, but we're going to come back and edit this rule later. So I'm going to call it that. If we click the generate button now, okay, the adverbial clause is positioned after the period. And if we rest our cursor, At the bottom it says inserted at end by phrase structure rule for clauses. So we need to tell our clause phrase structure rule where to position these adverbial clauses. So let's go to phrase structure rules. We'll say insert new constituent. This will be a clause. We're going to say preposed, and we'll give it a name. And it's inserted there at the top. We'll position it right there. And now if we click the generate button, okay, now our adverbial clause is at the beginning of the clause. We need to position this when, this add position or relation at the beginning of its clause. So that's also a phrase, a clause phrase structure rule. I don't need to specify a name. Now this is confusing to some people. This is our phrase structure rule that applies to all clauses. Now this here in the semantic representations, this is a clause. So this phrase structure rule will position all of these constituents, including this add position here, which we just entered. The larger proposition is also a clause. So this same clause phrase structure rule will apply to the larger constituent. Now the larger constituent, the larger clause, doesn't include an add position. In these phrase structure rules, all of the constituents are considered optional. Whichever constituents are present will be ordered as specified here. So this one phrase structure rule for clauses will position all of the constituents in this clause appropriately, and then later it will position all of the constituents in the larger clause appropriately. So I hope that makes sense. Let's generate this verse again. So now we see when John walks, John sings. In this segment we're not going to address pronouns, we're not going to insert a comma or anything like that. All I want to illustrate in this segment is we've set up a structural adjustment rule that looks for the concept when and then sets a feature. That feature is called adverbial clause position, and it sets it to preposed. Now if we go to the next verse, we see a similar situation with before. And if we go to the next verse, we see the exact same situation with after. So let's modify this rule. We're going to add the concepts before and after. Now when we add a concept, it doesn't appear, but if you rest your cursor right there, you'll see a pop-up listing all of the concepts that are included. So this now includes when and after. Let's also add the word before. We can't use lexical subset now, so let's go to before. So now this rule will be triggered by when, after, and before. If we generate this verse, and we look at our feature, again, adverbial clause position is preposed. Now so far we haven't done anything with postposed adverbial clauses. Let's add a new structure to this rule. These structural adjustment rules can have up to 99 structures. Okay, we've added a new structure and it copies the input structure for us, because quite often we'll just want to slightly modify this input structure. But in this case we don't want to include these prepositions. We're just going to say have an empty clause, but we want to specify that it has to be an adverbial clause. Now you may recall from an earlier segment we activated a rule which creates this feature for us, adverbial clause type. Now we want this structure in the rule to initialize this new feature to postposed. Now we only want this to apply to adverbial clauses, so I could go through and select all of these, but there's a much quicker way. As I mentioned in an earlier segment, we can right click here, and when you right click there's a red the cell is highlighted with a red background. I'm going to say not an adverbial clause. So in other words, that means this structure will only apply to adverbial clauses. And if we rest our cursor there, it says not in capital letters, then not an adverbial clause. That double negative makes an affirmative in English, so that will be for all adverbial clauses. Okay, we're shown a warning message. Before you can enter the output structure, you must enter at least one add position into the input structure. We've said that this rule is an add position, so that means every input structure needs to include an add position. It won't let us build the output structure until we include an add position, but in this case we don't want to include an add position, so we're going to change the rule syntactic category to clause. You can always select clause, and then that rule will apply, because all structural adjustment rules begin with clause boundaries. So we're going to say clause. Now it will let us go to the output structure. And now we can set the feature called adverbial clause position to preposed, or to postposed. We want this to be postposed. So this structure will look for all adverbial clauses and then set the feature called adverbial clause position to postposed. Now after this structure has been executed, we want to say, after applying this output structure, continue searching previous input structures. So when we check this box, this structure will be executed. Then it will begin searching the previous input structures. In this case, there's only one. So in this case, it will then look to see if the adverbial clause contains one of these prepositions, when, after, or before. If it does, it will set the feature called adverbial clause position to preposed. So let's execute this rule again. We'll click the generate button. And now, if we rest our cursor here, we'll see that up at the top of the pop-up, the features were changed from adverbial clause type equals unspecified to not an adverbial clause. That was done by the rule that we activated in an earlier segment. If you look down lower in the pop-up, about halfway down, features change from adverbial clause position equals unspecified to postposed by structural adjustment rule structure 2. That's the rule that we just wrote. Then down below that, features changed from adverbial clause position equals postposed to preposed by the rule that we just wrote, structure 1. So you can see that both structures of that rule were executed, and ultimately we end up with a feature value adverbial clause position equals preposed. So that illustrates how you can use multiple concepts to trigger a particular structure, and that also illustrates using this checkbox here. And that concludes this segment.